some of the market gardening basics as well in part one. So we'll look at the kind of that like basics of like growing, market garden setup, some of the lessons we've learned at Middle Ground Growers through trying probably every different way to start a market garden bed. So I'll share some kind of mistakes and learnings. So hopefully you don't have to make them as well, or you can sort of factor them into your decisions. And we'll also look at some sort of key infrastructure, key tools, and key techniques that we've kind of learned from I guess sort of managing a fair size min-till market garden in Somerset. Which I'll outline our story and our kind of market garden setup in a bit. But I just want to first like sort of ground it in and just in like why market gardening, why is that unique? And then the second half of the session we'll sort of go into like some of the economics, like sort of economic planning, financial forecasting, basically things that can allow you to like make better decisions on your farm in that day to day. When it comes to, oh, do we have budget for this, or how do we allocate these resources, XYZ, so many factors in growing. So hats off to everyone giving it a go. What I love about this world is it's so passion driven, and it needs to be because it needs the grit and determination to see us through. But there's not many industries where you'd have ask them, oh, what, don't know, there's many sort of accountants in London, maybe I'm wrong, that, how are you going to do this evening? I'll go do an accountancy webinar and learn nerd out on more accounting. So glad you're all here, and passion driven growers and wanting to learn more. And so we're going to dive into it basically. But still keep popping things in the chat. With names and places and what you're growing, and we'll get into it. And just sort of let me know. I tend to get quite passionate and excited and talk quite quickly. So just let me know if you want to sort of clarify anything or to slow down. So very briefly, just what is market gardening? I guess what makes it unique. Sort of some very broad definitions are basically growing fresh crops for community to sustain a livelihood. And there's this thing about like appropriate human scale food production, usually at the local level. So there's no hard and fast numbers of what size that is, what scale market gardening is or is not. I can't necessarily say that, but typically most market gardens are in the kind of 0 to 8 acres, usually for one or several livelihoods. And often it's, what makes market gardening often stand out is it's a very direct relationship with producer and consumer. And I'd also add, I guess, like a bit less mechanization often, but not always. Usually a bit more sort of connected directly to the soil. Usually sort of more like bio-intensive, close cropping, things like that. Usually very diverse as well. So you wouldn't usually have like a market garden that's just one crop. That's more of a kind of field crop. So that's what is market gardening. And now into the sort of the why market gardening. Maybe people can just pop a few things in the chat of like what initially comes to mind of like why market gardening, was maybe just like the first thing that comes to mind, maybe why you're doing it, but maybe also like why is it useful in our food system? What's the point? What's unique about market gardening? Do we need it? Why don't we just get rid of it? What's the use of this kind of a type and approach to growing? So maybe just pop a few ideas in the chat, and then I'll share a few of my ideas about that as well. Cool, thanks, Holly. So a bit about feeding, sort of localized food systems, increasing food production, feeding local community. That directs, the relationships, as Jimmy's saying there. So much more relationship building potentially at that local level. Lots of food from not much space, so it can be both very productive and nature friendly. Yeah, biodiversity. Thanks, Jazz. Less pests and disease. Yeah, we've certainly noticed that on our market garden with the diversity of crops. Cool, great. Well, keep control of what we can have. Chemical free, care for the soil, connection. Great. Keep adding those and populating them. I think it's really rich to sort of get the different reasons and maybe also like reflect on yeah, why you're interested in market gardening, because that's that kind of like drive that will keep you going through it. I'm still very passionate about it in my seventh cycle of market gardening. So yeah, it's good to continually touch base. Yeah, got a few sort of other related benefits that you guys have already touched on as well. For me, it's kind of like it's a bit of a gateway drug into like that food systems thing, potentially like very accessible. You know, you can get in, you can learn those hand tools without necessarily really like specialist or mechanic based or other based training. You can kind of get into it and learn those hands-on tools, and potentially quite a low hanging fruit of food system solutions. So, you know, when we look at like what can we, you know, in our destructive food system, what can we replace quite quickly, and what's the kind of obvious one is like, you know, produce that fresh food for communities right on their doorsteps. So that can usually like urban, peri-urban. Um, from yeah, in my experiences, it's like it can be much more economically viable than many forms of like land work farming. Unfortunately, just in the context of yeah, many types of farming and things like very much struggling. Obviously, market gardening is still a struggle to make really economic, but there's potential for that because of that direct supply, because of that diversity, because you can grow like higher value fresh crops. It's potentially got that viability, so it's potentially a good sort of business starter for getting into farming, for getting into sort of this more wider regenerative movement, and ecological viability as well. So you know, if like with everything, there's a good way to do it, and there's a there's a degenerative and a regenerative way to do it, but potentially it could be very like ecologically thriving. We've had incredible like soil health results, soil carbon stored, and worm counts and soil biology and fungal ratios in our market garden. Really just like skyrocketed through the year in terms of like soil testing and analysis, and the biodiversity, as someone mentioned in the chat. Reconnection to land, seasons, and soil. So it's back on that kind of like reconnection journey back to yeah, greater kind of understanding, awareness with the seasons and the soil. Yeah, we've got huge cultural historic roots with a market garden culture in our country. Maybe many of you like in the regions you are, maybe that used to be a town, you know, surrounded by market gardens, providing a lot of fresh food. So we've got this kind of cultural generational link. Um, yeah, it's really like fun, varied, meaningful, joyful livelihood. Obviously comes with all of its challenges and things like that, but it's yeah, it's an incredibly meaningful kind of full occupation. And yeah, accessible, quick to pick up, potentially a really good way to get lots of new entrants into farming. The average age of farmers is 59 in the UK, so it's a way in to all of that that work and this kind of gateway drug into the regenerative movement. For me, it's also a potential stepping stone towards like natural farming. So, you know, if we can get the soil in that really good, thriving state that's almost like a forest soil through no-till market gardening, we can then bring in towards some of the more like natural farming, bring in some perennials, bring in some like mini agroforestry to the market garden, and sort of have a kind of ecological succession towards truly natural farming. Yeah, so that's some of the sort of potential and benefits for me. And yeah, keep putting some in the chat because I'm sure you guys have got loads more as well. And just to touch on briefly, so I guess the kind of wider context and food piece picture, the potential of market gardening to actually produce a lot, a lot of our food is really high. So there's these reports from the Land Workers Alliance that really show the potential of like urban and peri-urban growing to, yeah, potentially actually to feed a lot of the fresh food supply in the UK. I'm going to look at no-till market gardening specifically. Um, and some of the reasons, yeah, why this approach to market gardening. And yeah, in our experience is this kind of like no-till or sometimes min-till approach, potentially is yeah, just like incredibly high yielding, really close plant spacings. The biology of the soil is really like pumping out a lot to actually give to those plants, so you can have a really potentially high yield. We're actually measuring all our yields this year with LWA, doing some research, so it's actually good to actually get some of the data of like how incredibly productive that market garden is. You know, the market garden on our site is just under 2 acres on a 16-acre site, and it produces the majority of the income from that for that land at the moment. So it's yeah, it's lots of high value, quick crops, that sort of thing. Yeah, and it's because of that kind of soil health focus. It's because of like less disturbance to the soil and all those ecological benefits. And yeah, the key point to this is like the diversity, so above and below ground, using that polycultures, really using that time and space efficiently, which is really key in that peri-urban land. And yeah, finally, it's sort of the employment factor, so it can potentially produce multiple wages per acre. So I'll talk a bit through our like kind of startup journey and how like we equated like the amount of labor, the amount of boxes per market garden size, which is hopefully useful. But I put a very like rough metric there. It's completely context dependent, so this might be not be the most accurate or necessarily relevant. But from our experiences, a really sort of pumping no-till market garden can potentially produce 50 veg boxes per acre, and about one full-time equivalent per person. And if you have the right systems and things set up, um, for sort of sort of lean farm, low weeding, low inputs, things like that, you can actually really maximize and actually generate a good livelihood from that market garden. So a little bit about our setup for market garden. So we're based in Somerset, so we're just on the edge of Bath, between Bath and Bristol. We're on a beautiful 16-acre site. And the market garden on the map here is just the sort of lower half. So we've got 9 blocks of no-till market garden. And this is on a sort of small rotation between like greens, legumes and alliums, root crops, brassicas, roots, other veg and salads with a few polytunnels. And it's a really small area of the site, but it's incredibly productive because it's grown at that human scale. It's really just producing a lot per bed. And you can see the wider site, we've got lots of other things going on. So the market garden's really complementary to all these other parts of the system. We've also got some field veg, we've got some ramule wood chip systems establishing from our coppice to try and provide that fertility holistically, and lots of fruit trees, lots of wildlife, wetland restoration, pollinators, pollinator fields, things like that. But yeah, the market garden is really sort of where we started, and it's kind of our roots at Middle Ground Growers, which sort of go through a bit of a potted history now. um, so yeah, a bit about sort of, I guess, my market gardening journey. Hopefully it's sort of useful to sort of look at some of the different like sizes and acreage and potentially what can be produced on those areas. But yeah, so I began about 10 years ago doing more like community growing. Moved on to a small narrowboat when I was 16. Got involved with allotments, some small local farms, very much into the sort of self-sufficiency, growing all my own food, producing my own energy, that sort of permacultural lens on life. And that got me really sort of inspired and hopeful for kind of being part of that solution. Growing food seemed to be like the best thing I could do to actually be part of the, kind of addressing some of the environmental, social challenges, and also just a love of working outdoors, a love of being more connected to the land and being on that journey. Um, so I went off traveling as soon as I could. Basically worked on many different farm setups, all different scales. Worked on market gardens. Um, some that like tiny, like quarter of an acre, and really absolutely like you know producing so much food on such a small area, and just like quarter of an acre, really good systems, really lean setup, and actually making kind of just as much money as some places on an acre and a half or 2 acres that maybe had slightly different systems. So I really learned that like this scale thing, it's about optimizing rather than maximizing. And that's not to say don't go for a bigger scale market garden. It's just to say like sometimes that optimization, get those systems right, and then it make them modular, and then you can kind of widen. Also worked on bigger commercial farms. That yeah, just it sort of seemed bonkers the inefficiencies, and the sort of the dangers of some like big scale organic and things like that. So I guess since then we've kind of found a bit of a middle way through that, and we're kind of looking at sort of small to medium scale growing. And yeah, do much more of the field veg. 2018-19, began growing on a small plot. So came back from this travels, all this different farm experience, working on dozens of different farms, and just wanted to like, find that access to land to get going on a plot basically, just to get hands in the soil. So began growing on a tiny, tiny tenth of an acre plot, just with friends at community allotments. Um, then had the opportunity to lease a bit more land, so up to that to like half an acre, providing for 30 veg boxes a week, with a market as well and a local wholesale outlet. This wasn't year-round productions. This was still limited to 8 or 9 months of the year at this stage. But even so, on this half acre, because we were sort of following a lot of these like no-till, bio-intensive approaches, looking at like kind of models from J.M. Fortier, Elliot Coleman, we could actually produce a lot of food on this area, and it was really yeah, the soil health was like fantastic, and we were cropping beds like multiple crops per year. Um, and it was really, yeah, really good to kind of model it on that small scale and start kind of with that the limitations we had at the start with a really small land area. That kind of was actually a strength in a way starting up. So providing those, yeah, a good amount of food from that half acre. We then kind of went through a process, a kind of whirlwind of like doubling, I guess, doubling production, doubling land area for a few years. So that was a kind of whirlwind, sometimes managing multiple sites. We upscaled to 65 boxes a week. That was still just on 1 acre on like a no-till market garden, and in a big orchard. We started traineeships. We started in a weekly market. We started doing more wholesale outlets. Um, so yeah, then it doubled again in 2022. This was kind of during some of that COVID whirlwind. Suddenly, lots of demand. There weren't loads of other kind of veg box schemes around as well. So we upscaled to 120 boxes per week. We're on 2.5 acres, more wholesale outlets, beginning to kind of pay off some of those startup costs, and also beginning to actually uh, slowly kind of earn that income. So yeah, officially year 2 of the CIC, but lots of like background work, background years of working on farms, volunteering on farms, trying to get through all the barriers of access to land and training and all of these things. Um, 2023 to 4, started growing between 140 to 180 veg boxes. And this was largely at our new site at Weston Spring Farm, which we managed to like community purchase and crowdfund for startup costs. So we got to like trial on a small plot, make lots of mistakes essentially, learn lots from that small plot, and then actually upscale it with a bit more budget to start it properly and to get the systems really well set up. So although there's lots of challenges of that first year's like lease land, 1 year lease, really expensive, really tricky. Actually having that kind of trial startup time, yeah, had its benefits basically. But now thankfully on much more long-term secure land, so we can really do those long-term systems as well. Um, and then yeah, this year we're going to talk a bit more like sort of about cash flow later, but broadly we're on £2,500 weekly income from veg boxes, and 1,500 weekly income from wholesale. Although this week we actually had like 3,000. It's one of our biggest ones ever. We had like loads of squash going out, like big full van full. So that felt really good. Felt like our felt like those days were actually sort of, yeah, still like pumping out some produce at this time of year. And that, yeah, so that kind of sums to an annual income of 200k from the veg, from those weekly veg sales. So we're kind of moving towards like doing much more wholesale, but we've still got a good number of veg boxes. So kind of a bit of a hybrid model there. We've still got a farmers market as well. So that's probably equivalent of, you know, 30 veg customers at that market, or more some weeks. So that's yeah, good number from there as well. And yeah, the point to make here, I guess, is that that's a very high income for a farm growing on a very small acreage. And a lot of that income, we've recorded our yields this year, and a lot of that income's coming from this very like productive market garden. Also, our field crops are really popping this year. It's been a really, really good year for them. So we're kind of glad to see those balancing out, which means we can grow a bit more through the winter, because some of the limits of market gardening are you've got to have that space available to be able to plant more stuff, in July, to actually get the winter crop in. So if you're in a very limited space, to do that year-round growing is very tricky. So that's where our field crops come in. Um, and a little bit about some sort of key like inspirations for me, and I'd say like really top resources if you're looking to sort of start out that market gardening journey. JM40, I was really I sort of geeked out on all of the YouTube videos, all the webinars, all the stuff with these guys and others. And yeah, just basically sort of went through that phase of being really obsessed with it, looking into all the details, really wanting to make market gardening work, really wanting to develop a livelihood from it. So I'd really encourage that like kind of curiosity approach and getting really obsessed with all the stuff to sort of go into your market gardening career with with all that backing of like these people that have been doing it for decades. So Elliot Coleman as well is another great inspiration. Really about like mastering the tools, techniques, and the processes on a really small scale to actually make a good livelihood from market gardening. So here's a bit of a summary of those two kind of schools of thought. Um, So JM40 school, we really like sort of emphasize that like, yeah, small can be profitable, very counter to the logic of kind of big economics, get big or get out kind of farming. Um, not to idealize the small scale, but to look at where small scale could be really appropriate in those peri-urban contexts. And JM40 really talked about like making a good livelihood and bringing in the lifestyle balance. So they'd, take off 3 months in the winter, go off skiing and enjoying life, and have a kind of achieving some of that more regenerative lifestyle as well as the regenerative growing. Because we can do all the regenerative work, but yeah, kind of what's to some extent, what's the point if we can't bring in the regenerative more and more into like the day to day and into the balance? So this is what I loved about JM40's approach. It was kind of put out that vision, put out that potential to kind of like thrive and grow. And also looked at really like modular systems, quite minimal startup things you could do that actually seem within reach, without a huge business grant or loan or something like that, something you can actually set up. So the first market garden I set up was really on a very shoestring budget. I was actually studying at uni. I was doing economics and stuff, but I wasn't actually at uni loads of the time. But I was kind of starting a market garden at the same time. I used basically my student loan to, I had very low living costs living on a boat. I actually used some of that student loan to start the market garden. And in an ideal world, we need, much more support for new entrants and things to help set these things up because it's such a small amount that can actually create so much benefit, these market gardens. So the JM40 really like encouraged and sort of showed some models for that. And also this kind of permanent bed system, which we have really like incredibly good for biology and ecology, and also incredibly productive. And then Elliot Coleman is kind of like the master of the tools and the sort of traditional market gardening and wisdom school. So really like looking at that kind of traditional organic growing, but bringing it into like those small productive spaces. And also looking at like year-round growing, crop protection methods, how to extend your season, things like that. So a few. I still got everyone. Am I going too fast, or is that okay? Cool. My voice is running a bit low. I think I've been using my field voice out in the fields recently too much. Um, so if you're going to go for a few kind of like design considerations and like startup for market gardening. Um, so yes, it's really both key for when you're looking at the startup phase, but I think I've also realized through our journey, kind of like almost every year, there often is like optimizing systems, changing systems, sometimes like redesigning the beds, changing the bed width. So the key lesson there is really like think about that design piece really at the start, like really go into that, reflect on it, go through a design process, do the visioning, learn from all the different sources, speak to others, speak to people that have been doing the market gardening for a long time. Um, and consider these like quite key questions of like what approach you're going to take. You're going to sort of go for like the full, Charles Dowdy, no till, no dig, cardboard compost, quite, probably quite on a small scale that could probably work. You could potentially have a weed free thing like these YouTube channels say, but I think in practice it's pretty tricky unless you're on like, 10 or 20 beds. Um, what sort of tools you're going to use because that will dictate all your systems. Are you going to use kind of a BCS, like a two-wheel walk behind tractor, which JM40 promotes quite a lot. Really helps you to enable to like do a market garden, bigger than an acre, for example, with minimal labor. or are you going to sort of do it purely on hand tools, or are you going to align it to a tractor system so you can actually do the market gardening, but also have like the bed width set to a tractor so you can top up the compost efficiently or the trailer. So you can potentially use other tools that are going to be useful on the tractor. So you can flail mow, for example, old crops to terminate. I'd really consider these, yeah, like key design considerations, both at the start, but also if you're halfway through your market garden journey, just be like, actually, is this like the best bed size? And is this, we do it all the time. I'm changing the bed. Well, I'm sort of quite interested to look at a different bed width system this year of like 1.2 meters. We've always done the typical market garden 75 centimeter wide, because that matches a lot of those small scale tools, which I'll go through in a minute. But actually looking at potentially like a 1.2 meter bed, that matches a lot of the tools, but just like double width. It actually also matches our tractor, so we can top up compost on the trailer. And it simplifies things, I guess. We've got over 200 beds of 20 meters at the moment, and potentially looking to simplify that to a smaller number of beds that are wider, less paths to make, less all of this sort of thing. But yeah, there's pros and cons to each one, and it'll be different for each context. So really look at that like bed paths, bed size, and standardization. So whatever sizes you do choose out of these sort of bed setup, really look at trying to standardize to try and make it match your tools, match the width of the rake, match the width of the griddler or the transplanter. Try and make it really efficient so you're not having all of these, daily little inefficiencies that add up to a lot over time. Also considering what are your inputs, what are your materials. The key ones are often like membrane, crop netting, compost, wood chip, all these different things. What materials have you got? What's going to be the costs of them? Looking at all those design pieces from the start, because then the systems you set up will be dictated by that. So whether you need a compost spreader or what sort of width of the paths make it actually work and make it easy to move the wood chip around, all of these things. Um, and I'd really encourage like a sort of permaculture lens and a kind of pattern design. So looking from the pattern to the detail. So really honing in on that detail of like what the bed size is, but then looking at the wider pattern. So for us, we've got 9 blocks. Each one's 20 beds of 20 meters. And that's the kind of pattern. And the first bed is always a pollinator and flower strip. Um, and then we've got membrane paths around the outside and then wood chip paths in the middle. So we're looking at the kind of patterns that mean we can manage that site as efficiently as possible and constantly redesign the next, winter as well. Look at that again critically. Um, Looking at functional diversity. So obviously considering what sort of crops you're going to grow, that's going to determine your type of system. And rather than getting too passionate and growing, like I remember we were growing like 90 varieties at one point, different veg, all the different varieties of everything. And rather than that, I think I'd really encourage in the startup or the scale up phase to really like focus on those top key crops. And we're going to do a bit of an activity to kind of like analyze how to make that decision, basically, both with the economics and the growing side, but really try and aim for like a functional diversity rather than um, just like more for more sake or diversity for diversity's sake, or like you need a good ecological diversity for that market garden to produce those benefits for soil and wildlife and for diversity of maybe your sales or your resilience. But also really needs like a functional diversity that can work for you and your farm systems and the enterprise that's going to sustain you and allow you to keep doing it. And your water systems really fundamental. Looking at really from the start designing that water system as best you can. Don't do what we did and like redig your trenches in year 1 and then year 2 again to like realize, oh, we needed like thicker pipe and we needed all these different things, different pumping system. Really think about those water systems and get support on that if you need. um, my business partner Sammy would be probably the best person I know to advise on that. So I won't talk any more about water. But basically, our system now is really great. We've got timers for the polytunnels that got really good pressure, so we can save loads and loads of time from those timers. And then we've got a sprinkler, which actually can sprinkler a whole market garden block. So that's 20 beds of 20 meters long. And that sprinkler can do the whole block. So we can actually just at the flick of a tap or to plug in that sprinkler, we can then water that whole block and then that can move around those 9 blocks of the market garden. So even in a summer heat wave, when the water is really tough, we can still water the whole market garden, um, without spending all week doing it, and then some crops are died or something like that. And there's potential also to put that on a time system. If we're going into more extreme weathers and more climatic changes, there's potential to, make that easy for yourself because the watering takes a lot of time. And finally, last but not least, the access and the workflow. So where are you going to position stuff relative to your infrastructure, to your access, to the areas of ground that are wet and dry and accessible? How wide are you going to have your paths where you need your harvest cart or your tractor or trailer or wheelbarrows or whatever your system is? Really make sure, literally just get a big map and draw all of those access lines and all of those workflows. It's really, really key. Um, that's me battery getting a bit low. Me solar on the boats. Not been amazing. Cool. So I hope still got people and following from the whistle stop tour of market garden growing. We're going to talk briefly about the kind of some key infrastructure tools and techniques, and might whiz through that because I want to save plenty of time for the kind of economic part, which I think maybe for some of the more some other seasoned growers in the room, maybe growers that probably have more experience than me, some of the economic stuff might be quite interesting to compare models and to have a look at. So I'm gonna sort of go through this part fairly quickly, and I want to leave time for the kind of questions and the economics part. Um, so key infrastructure, the very sort of nuts and bolts and basics of what you need on that market garden. In our experience is really crucial. Obviously, just have an operation space, wash, pack, process, cool room, storage. All of these infrastructures can vary from that very what we did in our early years was the very stingy startup. Like we had DIY cool rooms using CoolBot systems and secondhand insulation and very basic infrastructure. So starting it on a really shoestring budget. So you can do that. Don't get put off by needing a huge multi-million-pound fund or something to start this. But if you can, also set what you really need in terms of that space, and then I'll talk a bit about the economics of trying to bring that vision into reality in a bit. But yeah, ideally, really set up those operation spaces as really long term, really pest proof, and think about that workflow as well. So think about that wash pack process as literally you're coming in from the fields. We have our wash station there, we have the pack station, we have the cool room. We spend so much of our time on the plot moving stuff around from place to place. So we really need to optimize those systems rather than maximize, and look at how we can smooth that workflow basically. And part of your infrastructure is your protected cropping. So really thinking about the positioning of your greenhouses or your polytunnels or cloches and low tunnels. There's some great Elliot Coleman chapters about extending the season without big fancy infrastructure or £10,000 Dutch greenhouses. He's got some really cool systems if you're just in that startup phase, or if you're on a small growing area and you just want to keep the crops growing more through winter, having some low tunnels and cloches, using hoops and bending pipes and wire, and then having the polythene or even double layered enviromesh can really work as a good insulation from the frosts. And part of your infrastructure is also kind of looking at things like windbreaks. That's actually a key limiting factor in the market garden is the growth rate of your plants. Obviously the sunlight and all those things are really important, but the key one that people often miss is that wind element. So we're on quite an exposed site, so we're still waiting for our hedgerow to grow. But I'd actually recommend, if I was to start there again, I'd actually put in some sort of fencing or even a green scaffold netting, which is quite cheap, will actually reduce the wind flow by 50-60%, which can give your crops way more growth, way more protection, can save a crop, and can bring a lot more quality to those. And also enviromesh can break the wind as well, so using that in the right places. And finally your kind of site infrastructure, your fencing, deer protection, looking at movable equipment if you're on a temporary site, so electric fence wire systems, or looking at really long term, we've got a big deer fence with coppiced chestnut posts. That's around the whole site, so that really frees us up to grow with a lot more freedom, that it's not all going to be eaten by deer. But also Enviromesh, again, covering crops that way is a really cheap, effective way to, if you can weigh it down really well on the edges, that will actually stop a lot of the pest problems, even if you can't invest in a full fence system straight away. And as mentioned, also your water, your electrics, those basic utilities. And this photo is just to show that your infrastructure can be very basic. We sort of built a cabin in on the old site in, it was sort of a 2-week job in January, mostly secondhand materials. Had some like timber posts from a neighbouring woodland. Set up very basic infrastructure. Wasn't something that was really long term, but something that just like, yeah, kept us going at the start. And then when we, had the more budget and we had more of an idea of what we needed, then we went for the really long-term infrastructure setup. So this is our sort of barn at Weston Spring Farm. Can't get it all in the photo because it's pretty massive, and now it's got lots of uses. Yeah, lots of things going on in there, but we've still got that basic operation space that's really functional, really usable, really flat. We can get delivery bikes in and out. We can get the cool room and the fridge really accessible. So really, yeah, think about that infrastructure piece. And tools. So basic tools for the market garden. Usually do these workshops on site so we can sort of talk through the tools, but we've got a little photo of our tool, a little part of our tool wall. And yeah, the key ones for the market garden for me are like quality hand tools. So yeah, basic things of like, good, decent hose, fork, shovel, barrows, repair, DIY stuff. I like the idea of having like your tool stuff like arranged in task buckets. So if you need to do an irrigation job, there's a task bucket for that. If you need to do a quick DIY repair job or woodwork job, there's a bucket or a box for that. So trying to, on a small market garden, it's can be potentially easier to kind of keep those things all in their kind of places. And on our tool wall, we have like, you just have like a label for each thing. And it's, I don't know if you can see in the photo, but it's kind of laid out as in the process of which you use them. So if you need to do bed prep, all your tools are just there. Chuck them into the big wheelbarrow cart. If you need to do bed sowing, your tools are just there in the middle. If you need to do bed maintenance and weeding and hoeing, your tools are all just there. And yeah, keep those tools well maintained as well. And in terms of bed prep, so key tools will be like a broad fork if you're on heavier soils. We don't use our broad fork much anymore. We've got quite a nice loam, and the market garden's very like loose now, but we will occasionally find a bed that's like got a bit more clay and it needs a broad fork, which is basically a wide fork that can kind of loosen the soil, bring some oxygen into that soil life. It kind of sighs with relief as you pull back the broad fork, and it just gets a bit of aeration, decompacts the soil. Really good on a small scale. But yeah, maybe you don't need it once you've kind of got that market garden soil health really romping. And a tilther, which just kind of, this is the thing where it sort of becomes a grey area if it's like, min till, because it's disturbing the soil at the, top inch of the soil. The tilther kind of attaches to a drill battery. And it's a really simple usable tool, and it creates you a nice clean bed for seeding. And that just runs along the bed and creates a nice tilth. But yeah, any tool does some bed disturbance, like a hoe will also disturb the top inch of the soil. A rake will as well. So it's looking at what level you're willing to accept and what you can give back for that soil disturbance. So keeping living roots in the soil, keeping the crop diversity, all these things will help to counteract that. And then planting tools. So we have a griddler, which is really helpful. There's some from like Johnny's Seeds and some from TerraTech and things like that. And that basically just marks out your bed. So you can, in order to get your systems really good on the market garden and to keep those like standardized widths between crops so you can really efficiently hoe, it's really good just to standardize those as much as you can. And that's really helped if you have a tool like a griddler, which like sets those spacings to how you want them. Also seeders, transplanters, depending on your setup, you may or may not need those really complex tools like a paper pot transplanter or a really big Jang 3-row seeder. You might just need like an earthway seeder, which is much simpler. And in our experience, sometimes more reliable actually and easier. But yeah, sometimes it might really benefit you from to having more like precision tools if you're focusing on greens, maybe getting a greens quick cut harvester. I'd really encourage like those tools are like one-off purchases, whereas like labor is just like continual and very expensive. And yeah, you need to really like value your time and make sure you've got those right tools for the jobs. And of course, harvest tools. So looking at like not just like a random harvest knife or a pen knife, like looking at also specific harvest tools for the job that you need. So having like longer push knives, like the ones from Reag Tools for your sort of bigger head veg, and looking at the different techniques needed for that versus harvesting of greens with maybe a smaller opinel. Yeah, having that really good systems and techniques for those harvesting saves you a lot of time because at the end of the day, if you're doing a successful market garden, you want to be actually spending a lot of your time, I'd say most of it, like harvesting, packing, selling, delivering. So it's the funny paradox of the growing. The more successful it becomes, at least on one metric of success, the actual you kind of spend less time growing. It's definitely been an experience of the last couple of years. Um, a lot less time on actually like whether it's the weeding or the planting or those things. Like once you actually have those systems really down and you can get that done really well, then actually you're kind of spending a lot more of the time like harvesting, which is where the income is. So I'd say like in the current economic context, like actually you kind of want to design systems so you're spending like at least half your time doing the harvesting, packing, selling, to make that kind of market garden really viable, basically. Um, and yeah, finally looking at what's the appropriate machinery for your setup. So it might be a two-wheel tractor, it might be hand tools, it might be field scale, or like tractor production or tractor supported. I think there's a real role for kind of that appropriate technology and that the kind of like niche of that like smaller scale machinery to make market gardens really work well. Traditionally, there would have been small compact tractors, but also some market gardens more on hand tools. But certainly a lot of the ones in our valley do have like small compact tractors to run sort of large scale market gardens. I'd encourage looking at reagtools.com because they've kind of got all the tools broken down by task area. And yeah, you can get some really good like how-to guides and the videos and the resources, and then just kind of weigh up what you might need. And go and visit other market gardens to see what they've got. Um, and yeah, so techniques. So we're just going to go through like maybe the initial bed making because I don't quite have time to go through everything. But I'd say the key techniques to kind of really nail and get down and see different models of is like that initial bed setup and then the bed maintenance. So how you maintain that on a year-to-year basis, and your planting and seeding techniques, and the bed flip, which is really key. So how you transition a bed from the old crop to the new crop, and your different harvesting techniques and the kind of pre and post harvest workflow. So both with what you do with the crops, the washing, the cooling, the packing, but also like what you do on the fields then of like it might be removing dead leaves or it might be different processes for different setups. There's obviously a soil benefit of leaving more leaves, but taking those away can actually benefit potentially more like cleaner crop, some disease issues, things like that. So I'm going to whistle through these because I want to get on to the economics and then time for questions. But yeah, very briefly, like our kind of process and learnings from market garden setup, from like setting up market gardens in so many different ways. I've tried like the cardboard compost, the deturfing, the rotivating, then composting, the all the different ways. And what I'd recommend from all that is again very context dependent, but ideally, if you've got the luxury of time to like cover crop the area or tarp it for 12 months before, which is difficult because you obviously want to be making an income from that soon, but maybe there's in a way you can like tarp or cover crop half the market garden whilst growing on some and then switching that the next year. But if you've got that luxury of time, like putting in a cover crop like buckwheat, which will outcompete grasses, it's allelopathic, so it will kind of inhibit that rhizome growth of grasses. We've had really good success with that in the fields. Combining it with Facelia is really good as well to restore the soil health. That can be really good before because that will get your, if you're going from grass, assuming, or you're going from other sort of cropland, then it'll really get the soil structure going before you're going in and putting market garden crops. Um, or you can do, if you want to do a really like no-till approach, you can kind of like solarize or use tarps or silage sheets. Um, Obviously got the drawback of using plastic, but actually if you can do that on a small site for 12 months, then you've got a really lovely weed-free area to start with. And then you can build up your compost beds and probably have a lot less weed issues going down the line. Um, and if you don't have the luxury of time and or you want to do like the cardboard compost method, then I just suggest like mow the grass, lay the cardboard down. You can get cardboard rolls to speed up the process, but they're a little thin sometimes. So you kind of need, if you've got really thick grasses, you kind of want like 2 layers of the rolls, or you want really thick cardboard. Lay that cardboard down, and then we use like wooden frames that are like half a bed, sorry, full bed width, but half a bed long. Um, and then you can fill those frames to the desired depth. So make those frames like the depth and the width that you want. And then you'll get a really nice, neat start to your market garden. Or without the frames, you could use like string lines, so like a wooden batten at the end with 2 string lines that are going to make your paths, and then just load the compost into there. And if you're doing like more than 20 or more than 30 beds, then probably best to like borrow a front loader or borrow a tractor with a bucket, or hire a digger or a dumper, because yeah, once if you're costing in your labor, then you'll yeah, it's just a lot more cost effective to get that kind of support to actually make all those beds. Um, yeah, and then basically just sort of rake, move the frames along, and then fill the next bed. It can be as simple as that, really. But lots of different processes. You might want to take a more like cultivation approach and look to cultivate the first couple of years to get the ground in good shape, and then transition to the min-till or no-till market garden. Um, Lots of different approaches, but this is what I guess sort of my learnings from starting them. And the second key technique I'm going to go through is like a bed flip. So that's when you're getting that old crop out, lots of different ways to terminate that old crop and then getting the new crop in. And the real benefit of market gardening is you can flip beds quite quickly and efficiently. So you can actually have, you can keep those living roots in the soil, and you can multi-crop a lot per bed, because you're giving a lot to that soil, because you're composting, because you're disturbing the soil a lot less. We found we can have a lot of crops per bed at no detriment to soil health, actually really benefiting the soil health, having those different variety of crops and rooting depths through the season. Yeah, it's just shown to be really, really productive. Um, so the bed flip process, at least the version of what we do, so we terminate the old crop. So depending on the crop and depending on how deep rooting and depending on the season, there'll be a different method that's best. So I'd kind of say in order of priority, in order of like benefits to soil health, this would be my kind of like list in order. Like ideally, if you can just flail mow the crop, which we do with our 2-wheel tractor that flail mows the width of a bed, if you can flail mow it and then leave it for a week or tarp it for a week in the sun, and then kill it off and then plant, that's like the best for soil health. You've not disturbed the soil at all. You've kept the nutrients in the ground rather than taking all these roots and crops away to a compost pile. You've left them there, which is so much better. But that usually works for like shallow rooting things like some pak choy, some lettuce, some things like that. And sometimes it might need tarping or a second mow or a very shallow like hoe as well to kind of remove that root layer of the crop, depending on the season. Or you can just solarize, so using like black silage sheets or membrane. We use it's like a dark green woven sort of landscape membrane, which we find to be work really effectively, and it's UV stabilized, lasts for 30, 40 or more years. We can move it to areas of the market garden that have a lot of perennial weed problems, to kind of reset that block if we've like fallen behind on the composting or weeding or something like that. Or like, worst case scenario, just like pull the crops out, pull their roots, or like cut the roots really low to the ground and then remove them. But that's a lot more labor, not as good for soil health. Um, and then once you've terminated the crop, then the second step is to assess that state of that bed. And if you need to like weed or add more compost or broad fork if it's compacted, then do what you need to do. And then after that, we would tilth. Um, if there wasn't already like a nice tilth, you can actually just get a nice tilth from like hoeing and raking, or even just if it's really the beds are really good, then you might not need to do much at all. You might just need to hoe off and rake, and then you're planting. And that's the beauty of market gardening. When it's working, you can reset those beds really quickly and keep the production going. And then you want to rake and sow, if you're direct seeding, or griddle to mark out your beds, and transplant if you're transplanting, and then water in. And then if you need to mesh them or do anything else for that crop, then do that. So that's whistle stop tour of the growing side. And now I'm going to go through a little bit of the economics, just for maybe, I think we're going to have time sort of 10-15 minutes of this. Because I want to leave a bit of time for questions and things. So ready for economics part? It's so strange not seeing anyone and just talking to myself on a screen, but I'll get over that. Cool. So yeah, I guess I came from sort of studying economics background, and yeah, then really sort of became interested in this kind of like regenerative piece, and just sort of nerded out on regenerative economics. And so I'm quite, yeah, really passionate about bringing that to the market gardening and growing context and helping small farms work. Um, so a few tools that we use for our kind of economics. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know if you have any other sort of tools you might use. Maybe pop them in the chat. Yeah, I'd love to sort of do a hands up sort of thing, but we can't. I don't know if we can do that. But yeah, it'd be interesting to know like who does like a cash flow analysis or some form of that on their farm. And does anyone do financial forecasting? Does anyone like, I mean, I guess most people do like a profit and loss, because usually you need to do for like an end of year thing. But yeah, does anyone do any of the more detailed stuff? And yeah, what tools or what platforms or what softwares might you use? Yeah, interesting. It's always interesting to see different systems. But yeah, for us, we use like very simple spreadsheets for like the kind of financial forecasts. And once it's actually not, it takes a bit of, it's a kind of permaculture approach, or like a perennial approach, because you have to put the time in at the first, get those perennial systems in of like the cash flow sheet and the balance sheet. And um, yeah, then once that's set up, it's kind of things, those tools you can use to aid your day-to-day decision making. So if you're like, okay, what budget can we allocate for this year, or even like, do we have budget for that new transplanter or tool? You can actually use these systems and spreadsheets to like really aid that decision making, and it's, yeah, so useful. Or you can even like, predict if you're going to be in 3 months time at a really low cash flow point, or if, yeah, all these different factors, you can give yourself that information through some simple tools. And it doesn't need to be big, scary, crazy complex spreadsheets. It can be simple enough tools, which I try and demystify a bit. We also use Xero for our accounting, because we've got lots of complex operations, sub enterprises, projects, lots of things going on. So we use a software called Xero, which is really helpful. We use Wix for all the orders. So all the wholesale orders come in, they get printed out onto sheets, the harvest lists go down, and then we can send those invoices automatically through the web ordering system. So it's really easy. We can update the availability online. So we're trying to like make a lot less manual systems, a lot less manual invoicing, manual errors on this, less like writing out by hand all of the notes and all of the stuff, because so many things go wrong from that, and just takes a lot of our precious time that we want to be out on the land using. And Ubi's been really useful for like veg bags to manage the complexity of 150 or so customers sometimes, like all of those different orders, all the different things. People can select their preferences, update the holidays, and it'll just print out a delivery sheet for us, a round packing sheet. And we get support, so from accountants that can do some of the things like the payroll with, some point. Sometimes we've got 9 employees to pay on the payroll, and lots of different tax codes and holiday pays and sick pay and pension stuff and all these things to work out, and national insurance things, and you want to get it all right. So we have accountants to help with some of those. And crop profitability index is a really key one, which I'm going to go through in a minute, to work out what crops are actually profitable for you, which ones, yeah, potentially not worth growing. How can you like make that functional diversity, yeah, make that work for you in the farm? And yeah, really key like monthly and quarterly cash flow analysis. And again, the key point is like optimizing rather than maximizing. So really optimize those farm systems and optimize the economics. Um, And some of the key like growing variables, at least for me, are like for the market garden, it's often like high value crops, short days to maturity, so quite quick crops like radishes, 25 days. So then you can get lots of crops in a bed. Um, or you can have more time for cover crops, for example, or more time to prep that bed, et cetera, et cetera. Focusing on like your top crops that actually do best in your soil and earn you most. Especially if you're limited on space, don't have any lost leaders or things like that, in my view. And high rotation, multi-cropping, but also make sure if you're doing that, you need to really be giving back to the soil and really like focusing on that biological approach. Anything that can extend your season or keep, yeah, those winter greens or like winter income coming, things that are very low input, so things that are very like time efficient or require much less feeding, or yeah, inputs like things like spring onions we just sow directly as an understory to bush beans, and very low input, easy to harvest. Yeah, don't take loads of nutrients from the soil, not like a heavy feeder. It's a really good one for us. And finding the optimal labor input as well. Bless me. So I'm going to talk briefly about cash flow and then crop profitability index, and then save some time for questions. So do get any in the Q&A box, and we'll get to some of those. So I like to sort of teach the economics, actually do a whole day workshop on it. So sorry I've then had to cram this into a short session, but basically I like to look from the pattern to the detail. So your pattern economics is your like profit and loss, your like cash flow, which is your money coming in and out every month or every quarter, and then really hone right into the detail of like what's the economics of that carrot bed. Because you really need to know, because that detail level makes up what your actual end of year profit and bottom line is. So starting from that kind of like pattern level, I'd really encourage like a kind of cash flow analysis, even if you just do it and take a snapshot, but ideally look at the average through the year, and really look at how you can make sure that you can like inform your decisions really well to make sure your like cash flow and your weekly income in is not like in the red every week, because like a small amount in the red every week adds up to like then like a lot over the year. So a quick example of that, cash flow is just basically your money in, your money out, and then the net difference. And for seasonal growers, it's really important because the cash flow varies so much through the year. So you want to look at like averaging out your overall costs through the year, all your overheads, your direct costs, your seeds, all of that, and looking at what's the average you're paying out per week, and then contrasting that to your average income, which also obviously varies a lot with seasonal growing. So, for example, a very simplified example from us, because we've now got lots of different things and sub enterprises and all sorts, but we try and keep like the actual growing economics really separate, and we keep it separate from things like grants and other stuff. Like if we have a grant for a project, we do that project under that budget, and we try and to keep the veg box stuff really resilient. We really look at the cash flow just on the pure operations growing and veg sales perspective to make sure that business is really resilient. So an example, very simplified, is like the weekly income. And this was like from earlier in the season, was 2,500 from veg boxes, 1,500 from wholesale. So that's a 4,000 weekly inflow. Each week we employ 25 days labor, so that's 2,500 outflow every week with labor, which is our biggest cost. And our weekly costs averaged out, so all of those things, all the overheads, all the seeds, water, etc., all adds up to about £900 a week. So it's a lot per year, but that makes the total outflow per week of 3,400. So we can leave an average cash flow of £600 per week, which seems like a good amount. That's nice and healthy. It doesn't averages out through the year to then like about 30 grand. And then once we look at like reinvesting in stuff for the next year, and once we look at the winter costs come in, a lot of the costs for next year coming in the winter, and various other things, like actually that cash flow is kind of, that's where we should be aiming, rather than like aiming for 0 or aiming for 100 cash flow. We want to aim for this, because then we design for resilience. We also design for things if they go wrong. We have a buffer budget for different things, repairs budget, maintenance budget, etc. So very brief illustration of cash flow, but try and do that to see if you're in the green every week. And that requires going through your overall costs and then dividing that by the number of weeks. And also maybe do it for the month. So especially if you have things like some costs that are just going out every month, or like certain invoices or labor, then try and look at it on a month by month basis as well. And maybe even for the season, or like a pattern to see where you might have the dips in cash flow. So an example here is like through the seasons, looking at our inflows every month and looking at the outflows, and then looking at like the net through the year. So this monthly cash flow, rather than averaging, this actually takes into account, this is a slightly different tool. I have it on a separate spreadsheet that just looks at, okay, what are we actually, the reality of like the income in February or something. We actually paused wholesale for a few weeks last year. Oh, this was 2022. So this was a couple of years ago. So actually looking at realistically, oh, we're going to have a shortfall there. The bank balance will go down to that, but it's okay because the uptake will come in May and da 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 da. But we know we can still cover costs, and we know we can look after people still, make sure we pay all the wages, etc., etc. So yeah, keep that planning thing in mind. And then of course the bigger picture pattern is like your profit and loss. So making sure that that bottom line is really there. So this was our kind of, yeah, yearly, annual, like you've got the total income, the direct costs, overheads, which is your kind of like labor and maybe like utilities and other stuff, um, software fees, etc., and then the actual profit at the end of that. And this is a little activity I'd really encourage you to do. We sort of go through it in detail in like more in-person workshops, but this is maybe something you can take home. Um, Choose a crop of your choice and look at the microeconomics of like one bed space for your system. And you can choose whatever variables you want, because this will be based on your system and your context in terms of what is valuable to you. But generally the biggest ones for us are like the value for that plant. So say I'm taking a bed of radishes, it's 20-meter bed. Um, we crop, say, 200 bunch of radish in the market garden bed. So the value, it's £1 per bunch of radish going wholesale. So that's £200 from that bed. The yield across the year is quite high because you can get a lot of radish crops in a one bed equivalent in the market garden. So the yield quantity through the year is quite high. So it gets a high score for this. So this activity is like looking at trying to give a score for each of these and trying to like put some numbers or approximations to your crops. So then you can actually have a decision making tool to say, okay, I think like tomatoes are profitable, but are they actually? Like I've sort of like done rough calculations, and they might be in some contexts, but like our cucumbers are nearly 3 times more profitable than tomatoes. So I can use that decision making tool and say, well, how much then do we want to grow of these, or et cetera, et cetera. Similarly with other stuff, we might have chosen to get rid of some crops because you just looked at this and said, okay, this is actually half as profitable as another brassica that grows exactly the same. We put the same labor in, but it's half as profitable. So we're going to choose that one, choose the good one instead. So yeah, like don't assume that like a crop, just because you like it or just because it's sells quite well or because it's quite popular this, it doesn't necessarily mean it's like causing you a loss or a profit or anything in the system. So give each of these a score and then add up your total scores. You might want to use other variables. And then you can put that onto a spreadsheet if you love getting really nerdy about it like me, or you can just kind of use those like approximations to help inform your decisions. I want to kind of develop a bit of an app where people can just like basically do like a little quiz and questionnaire, and they can just type in their things, and then it comes up with their crops that make sense, at least from this economic framing. You might want to add in other variables. You might want to add like, oh, this crop, like, yeah, different examples, different contexts. But basically, it just gives you a score. So this column on the right, this will just give you like a crop profitability index. And what I tend to do is I look through those scores after I've like approximated the like ratings for each crop, and then I say, okay, well, anything that's like scored below 10, I'm not sure if we can justify doing that with like the margins of veg, or we need to grow it in a different way perhaps, or we need to put the price up for that thing, or we need to do XYZ. So it helps to inform decisions basically. And yeah, key message, like for holistic farm economics, most of your farms will probably be doing so much more than just the food production. So I would really encourage like the approach to economics to like separate the food production, the operation, and say like this has this cost, the actual food production, not like all of the wider stuff you're doing, like all the social good, all the environmental work, all of the, all of that sort of thing. Like try and look at the base costs of that food operation, um, and keep that as its own like separate resilient entity. And then separately, what we do is then we assess what like other aims we might have. So we might have an aim of like educational things. We're not going to try and fund doing educational stuff and creating opportunities and land access, or fund a wetland or fund a pollinator project. We're not going to try and fund that through the sale of carrots, because it's just the margins are so low. Ideally, in a different system we might be able to, but actually we look at getting support and getting funding or crowdfunding if there's something we need to do that falls kind of outside of that remit of the actual food production thing, which might seem a bit like hardlined economic thing, but I think otherwise you get into a situation where like you're doing all this work and you might get like some money from some other thing here, but it's not necessarily like resilient, or it gets merged with the business economics of the food production, so that food production isn't resilient. It's not going to carry on unless it has this other grant thing coming in. Or you can have the opposite, where you're like all of your income from the veg is then siphoned off into doing all your other social work and good, and then you're not actually like valuing all of that, the sort of income you've got. And it's sort of, a farm can be a sink, especially if it's a holistic farm. So I would say like keep them almost separate, as separate budget lines, separate projects. And then that's for example why we did the crowdfunder. We knew that we needed XYZ startup costs to actually like set up the systems we needed to do. So I'm going to talk very briefly about a little like tips for crowdfunding, because I do think it's really worth like considering those different funding options, given the economic climate. Potentially possible, and with like good market gardening and no-till stuff, like you can really optimize those systems and do really well in it. But I think if you're like looking to set up those bigger systems and like cover some startup costs, and to do like wider, more holistic aims and wider stuff that you want to do with that, then I think like try and set the vision and the mission, and then like backcast from there, rather than like this sort of scarcity economics approach where you like kind of, well, what can we make do with these like pennies here and there that we've got from this sale. Rather like think ahead and try and like backcast from the systems and the vision you want to set up, and then say, okay, what realistic money do we need? This is what we did for the crowdfunder. We said, oh, realistically, we need £95,000 to set up this bigger ambitious project, set up a whole new farm, do the barn properly, do the solar, do the electric delivery bikes, etc., etc. And then we backcast from there and said, oh, we need this amount, and we're gonna, we've already sort of proven our worth a bit in our community. We've already grown food. We're gonna then set that. So that's what I'd recommend in terms of those like startup things, but every context will be different. And a few top tips for that kind of crowdfunding, or maybe links to other sources of funding, is lots of preparation. So try and secure 30% of funders in advance if you can, because most crowdfunders that are successful have already gained the kind of the whoosh at the start, and then that gets bumped up to the top of crowdfunder. It gets lots of momentum. People psychologically buy in because there's already 30% there. It's I think it's really key to like do the preparation stuff in advance, do all the timelines, and secondly, get your narrative and your story and messaging just right. So looking at the words you're using rather than just your language, or like what actually will appeal to others. Like, we didn't like hone in too much on the organic, because we knew we were in an area where actually people would tune in more to like local, even more so than environmental, or different things like that. And people might tune in more to like market garden heritage and our history, rather than necessarily like visionary agroecological food systems, or as our language, but it's not other people. So think about the messaging, think about who you're wanting to get that across to, beyond the crowds, beyond the bubbles, and also still speak to the people that you already know as well. So find that balance, and then set a really clear vision, set those clear objectives, do the co-design, do the design processes together as a team if you are, or whatever the project is, and really show clearly how pragmatic and practical the information you've thought through, those systems you've thought through, actually you're almost like doing it already. You're like got the implementation sorted. That really inspires people to get involved with it. Yeah, I want to support that. And the context and timing of like when you release it. So we released ours like after COP29, put out this big crowdfunder for 95 grand and secured it in 10 weeks. And it was this timing of like, everyone was just like feeling like, oh, another like COP meeting, another like business as usual, no action. Like we just need like stuff to happen, like on the local level. We just like people hungry for that change. And pre-COVID, sort of early days of COVID, people I think, oh, there's lack of food on the shelves, all these things. Like people can understand more viscerally the message because the context, it's like the idea whose time has come. People are like, yeah. let's do that. Like at the moment, it's like river action stuff. People just are tuned into this at the right time, and bring that passion and energy and purpose. That's really key to let that shine through. And for us, that took a bit. It was quite uncomfortable because we didn't really want to do the more like pushing it outwardly, and then the crowdfunder actually the biggest blessing, actually maybe bigger than the financial gain was actually like we just widened that network so much bigger. We got so many more people involved. So huge benefits from that. Um, and could show the crowdfunding video, but maybe might pause for questions actually because I've rambled on slightly over the time planned. So maybe have a look at that video on YouTube, crowdfunder ecological farm for Bath. Um, oh, just click next. There we go. But basically, we raised the money and had 550 supporters to raise 96,000, and then we implemented the vision. This is our solar barn, our agroforestry with courgettes and lots of phacelia and buckwheat and plum orchard. And yeah, I've gone through some of those sort of crowdfunding tips, but do get in touch if you want more detail. I also do a bit of like business farm economics sort of consulting over winter, usually only 2 or 3 projects, but just to like I really want to support small farms to work and thrive. And some of the systems take a bit of setup. Once you've got the models and the spreadsheets and things already there, you can really help those inform your decisions on the day to day. And yeah, I just want to really sort of reinforce that final message of like rather than just you need to do the forecasting and that thing in head, but also like look at that backcasting and see like what's that vision, what do we want to make our farm like truly thrive, even within this really tough context. It's really tricky for growers right now. But then look back from that and they say, okay, what support do we need? What X, Y, Z, da 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 da. Take the courage and the boldness to do that. It's out of the typical farmer identity of we'll just do it ourselves, or But yeah, that's the sort of key messages really. So I'll wrap up there. And yeah, just really encourage you to like put on that financial hat sometimes more often, even if it's a bit uncomfortable. Doesn't have to just be about like the sort of hardline economics, but actually it's about valuing your time. It's about making sure your thing's going to thrive in the long term, be resilient, making sure your systems are really set up. Look at that pattern to detail approach, the bigger economics, and then zoom into that like carrot bed, that like individual thing or that task. Yeah, so look at the micro and the macro scale, and use all those tools you can, because it's really tricky to do it all manually. But there are some great tools out there and some great people that can support with it, and just develop that kind of economics muscle. And if you want support from me or from other collaborators, I bring people in with expertise and other stuff, such as co-visioning and non-violent communication and things from friends that bring in these services. Get in touch and I'll be happy to help. hamishevans.solutions. And yes, so I've gone slightly over, Lizzie, in terms of not leaving much time for questions, but hopefully got across 2 workshops in one. And I hope it was useful for you all.
Yeah, it's really brilliant. Thank you. So I mean, I for one have got like 3 pages of notes, so I'm definitely going to be using a lot of that knowledge. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, you can check on the Q&A if you want to answer those ones. There's 4 questions so far.
I can see the webinar chats, but I can't actually. Hang on.
Well, I can ask you if you want.
Yeah, why don't you pick what you think's most like common there or relevant, and ask them to me.
There's a couple of questions relating to the irrigation system. So, what sprinkler do you use for your 20 bed block? And yeah, same question. So yeah, if you could expand on the sprinkler issue.
Irrigation, yeah, great. That's the one area of the farm I probably can't so much. I don't know if Sammy is in tuning in and on the chat, but maybe Sammy can put the irrigation type and I'll send it in the emails. I've got but basically it's the sort of tripod, those tripod ones. I think it's just from waterirrigation.co.uk. They like supply a lot of different parts. It's like a tripod one with a head sprinkler that rotates in a circle, and it can do a sort of 25 or more meter radius if you set the pressure right. So it's all about getting the pressure right and the pipe size is right. So we go from like a wide pipe, big storage tank, good pump, wide pipe, then goes into small pipe, and then goes into that sprinkler system. Um, yeah, it's a really, really great system. We've also got all of our fields set up with irrigation now as well. Sammy's been really on it with that. Been lots of digger work and winter irrigation stuff, but yeah, getting really good quality, strong parts. Like the irrigation is so, so important, especially with changing climate. But I'm afraid I don't have the model of that sprinkler on me, but I can send that in some follow-up notes.
Awesome. And then there's another one from Jimmy. In regards to the economics, what would you recommend is worth paying somebody to do, and what is worth doing yourself? We're coming to the end of our second year and grappling with what we should be doing ourselves and what areas should we seek help with, for
Yeah, really,
example.
that's a really great question. Thanks, Jimmy. I think more and more over time, I'm more of the mindset of like, and obviously it comes with putting maybe a bit more budget towards it sometimes, but I'm more of the mind of like get the help when needed. Like for example, we needed a really particular bit of like kit, like scarify before our wildflower meadow. We didn't have the kit, we didn't have the expertise. We just got a neighbor, a farming neighbor, into like sort of contract and do it. And so I think like yeah, just those like niche things that might just save you like tons of manual labor or tons of stuff or systems, or the stuff maybe you're not so comfortable with. It might even be like, you know, the annual machinery service, or it might be other things. I mean, it's really empowering to like learn it all and do it all yourself, but I think the more you can like call on that help and say, actually, yeah, it's really good to get this. So we get a lot of like, sometimes we did just do it all ourselves in the start, but I think now we're trying to have more of the mindset like we've got a carpenter guy that can come and do the stuff for the barn and the infrastructure. We've got someone we can call on just to do the cool room and all of that stuff, because we don't want to get that wrong. It's like messing with aircon units and expensive parts. So we just have someone that comes and does that. It's a lot more expensive per hour than us, obviously, but we can focus more on the growing and ultimately probably save time on not having to do loads of little repairs and saving mistakes in the long term. So yeah, say maybe some of those more specialist things, but it'll depend on your like context and skills and what help is around. Yeah, but I'd favor more and more over time, just like leaning on that support for those anything that's setting up a long term system. Even just get a bit of advice or consultancy or support, or talk to experienced growers, or anything that's like a long term thing. I'd say like the things that are like the quick job here or the quick fix there, like, you know, we can do elements of those ourselves more. But yeah, for those longer term systems like perennial stuff, yeah, put in the perennial care and get the help. Oh, and accountant. No, I think that's just a follow up question from Jimmy, but is yeah, in terms of the accountants, yeah, I'd say like getting, especially for like if you can just even getting an accountant for like 1 year, that will help you set up all those systems for like being employment ready. And then you don't necessarily have to like then keep that accountant going for like years. Like we had a professional accountant that we've now actually stopped using. We now use a friend who's also a Vegbox customer who can just help with the payroll. But we actually had that really quite professional help, I guess, in the early years, which was more expensive. We were probably paying too much for accountancy fees, but it did take a lot of stress off my hands, because I could have done some of it, but actually I wanted to be doing more of the other stuff from the growing. So yeah, actually having them set up, especially the things around employment and some of the payroll stuff and some of the tax stuff, that really helps. Like you can work it all out and do it if you've got the time. But yeah, it really helps. Like have that first year with accountant support, or even like someone to set you up with those systems, just to spend a few days on it can be a really worthwhile investment. I can actually see the questions now, so I can take those now. Yeah, we dive
There's
into Robert's question on compost and wood chip. So we get wood chip for free from tree surgeons. We've also got a small wood chipper now on our BCS, which is really cool. So that can do our own like Ramio wood chip. But we actually get loads of wood chip from tree surgeons. And there's a few things like chip drop and just contacting and getting to know people in the area that really help. And we buy compost in. It's about £10 a ton. Council Green Waste, PAS 100 organic compost. Basically just bulk organic matter. It's not biologically sound or rich or anything. It's just basically bulk organic matter that we buy. But then we'll inoculate it with things. We'll put worms from our wormery. We'll put compost teas. We'll put the microbiology in, and we'll get it resting and inoculating over a good amount of time, ideally. And then we'll put that on the beds. That's the kind of system we wanted to move towards. Like get the fungal ratios right and then apply it. But we do buy the bulk, like the bulk stuff from a Chap that delivers it on a big tractor and trailer, £10 a ton. It's great. Veg box. I'd go to the next question from Rachel. So, top tips for building veg box customers. Yeah, it's a really tricky one. It goes through phases. Like in the early years, um, it potentially more easier because a lot of the people that are already into this sort of stuff will reach out to you. You've got the kind of like low hanging fruit, I guess, in that way. But then into the later years, when you're scaling up, it becomes you do need more like focused like marketing strategy, like looking at the places where people that are interested in organic food will already go, like going to the farmers markets, going to the pop-up events, doing all the stuff, doing the online, like really engaging with the online and social media stuff. We have got a lot of veg box signups through that, but also equally we still get a lot through the farmers market. So trying to engage in like a mix of approaches, but also adjust as that veg box journey continues, because in the later years you'll have to appeal to the people that aren't like pure CSA or aren't like XYZ. I think once you get above like 60 or 70 boxes in most areas, unless you're really population dense, once you get above that number of boxes, like we found we needed to like compromise a lot more. Like the Ubi stuff really helps with the flexibility, because now people can kind of select preferences more. They can go on holiday, they can adjust quite flexibly, and we can just get a summary of what we need to print, and ultimately it probably keeps customers for longer. And it matches people's lifestyles and things more, so we kind of, yeah, we do compromise more over time to keep a wider pool of customers and reach out to people beyond the already converted and gets those people into this kind of food system. So our veg box customer building shifts over time, goes in unexpected directions. But yeah, try and do like a mix of tools basically, online, in person. Don't be afraid to shout about it, because what you're doing is pretty amazing in my view. Um, and then a question from Sam about keeping track of the data during the busy time of the season, but then reviewing the winter. Yeah, that's a really key one, and I don't do it perfectly at all, but I find some tools help. Like I actually use like Google Notes and Google Tasks a lot. So in the field, I can quickly add a task thing to Google Notes, and it can be on a shared list, so other team members can see the different areas. Or there's like an area for growing, there's an area for financials, and I can put those stuff on to then like bank that, and then I can go through. Now this time of year I'm like going through all the yields, I'm going through all the stuff and recording it and actually analyzing the data when it's a bit quieter. But also the more you can get, I mean, I never thought I'd say this, but like the more you can get the systems online, the better. Like all of our sales are all, the data's already there, because people have gone through their like online Ubi account, or they've gone through the website order, so it's all been ordered, it's all there. So we can actually look. I can just really quickly go into the website app, and I can really quickly see like the top seller from the month. I can see the exact amount of beetroot sold through the year. I can see the exact amount. I can like list and put a graph to the priorities of all the things. Similarly with the accounting with Zero, I can go in at any point and I can look at the graph of like the inflows and outflows, because we've kind of like logged that data at the right time online, and because we've kind of got some systems in place that match the invoices to this payment, etc., etc. So there's ways to get it so that you can reduce some of that manual thing of like having a load of notes every, my early years I just had like notebooks everywhere and like so much manual data, and it explodes my head. So I don't have the head capacity to like be with the land on that day, or I don't have the head capacity to like run a team well on the day, because I'm like got a million tasks and stuff flying in my head. Whereas now I do use some of the tools and technology a bit and say, okay, I can just put that on me tasks thing, or I can just like that sale is just there and then it's out my head. It's a lot more peaceful. Still crazy in the peak of summer, right? But it definitely helps ease those things. And can actually help me to be like more efficient and flowing in the day to day. Because yeah, you're right. In the busy time of the season, it's the data management is really tricky. But I think farmers do have to like accept to an extent we are like data harvesters. Sounds a bit like sort of dry, but we're constantly observing and interacting with like we're harnessing like the observations from the land, and the more we can actually do something with that information and those observations and that like land wisdom to inform our actions and our decisions more tangibly, and bringing in the intuitive farming as well, because that comes from that. But the more we can, I think, build and merge both, really helps, I think, in terms of like pragmatic decision making, and also building it holistically and resourcing yourself for that. Yeah, hope that helps. So the question Q&A was quite rushed. There's really some really good juicy questions in there. So thanks for
There's just two more in the chat that I just want to forward to you. So one from Dan. Are you including your weekly markets under wholesale figures? And then one from Holly. Did you secure the land for the market garden before you started the crowdfunder?
Yes, so the markets is actually in the veg box figures. It's sort of like a veg box equivalent, I guess. Or actually we did a weekly market in the startup, and now we do a fortnightly Saturday market. It's probably only 1% or 2% of our income, so the most is from like veg boxes and wholesale, but the markets is for like a £500 market once a fortnight. So it's yeah, it helps, and it's mainly for like also like our direct link and like customer interaction, and like we also get a lot of veg box signups in the market, and it's a really amazing fun market to be at. So the market's a little add-on in terms of the business, like it's a sort of very small percent. um yeah, I think in terms of like the actual labor involved and the time to pay someone to be at the market and all those things mean the market can be a very like it can be a bit of a resource drain on we found in experiences. But I think for us, because it's the public engagement, because it's getting vegbox customers, and because it can just about cover its costs, we keep it in the market. But yeah, it's kind of included in that the vegbox figure, but a very small amount of it. And remind me the second question, Lizzie.
From Holly, did you secure the land for the market garden before you started your crowdfunder?
Yes, so we were growing on leased land, but we basically secured the new site, the 16 acres. So we could come to the crowdfunder saying like we have um, this like opportunity to grow more. We need to start crowdfund for like these startup costs, and yeah, we leasing land as well. So we actually managed the two sites in tandem for a while, which is crazy. But also lots of lessons, and now we're kind of more focused on like the main site, but also have like trainees and other growers in the area that are kind of setting up on new sites. So we're kind of looking at like the multiplication model rather than like maximize it. Again, it's like optimize and like do what you do well and multiply. But yeah, we'd secured the land, a group of us, basically what yeah, to sort of secure it. We did everything we could, sort of fundraise, reached out to people, philanthropists, all sorts to do it, and secure the 16 acres, and then set the vision, the design, and then went about the crowdfunding side of things. But there'll be a million different ways to do it, so don't think you need to get the land before, or some people crowdfund to get that piece of land, or etc etc. But we took that approach.
Brilliant. We've finished all the questions and only 6 minutes over.
Cool.
Um, yeah, thank you so much. That was really, really amazing and so completely packed with information. So yeah, good job on packing those two things into one session in an hour and a half.
Cool. Well, thanks everyone. Yeah, cheers for tuning in on a Wednesday night. And yeah, get in touch with any sort of yeah follow-up questions or things. Yeah, as I said, take on some sort of like project support things through the winter as well. Sort of passionate about helping make those small farms work. Yeah, thanks for absorbing all that information on a Wednesday evening. I think I'd definitely do I'd split them into two sessions another time, but I think I like reinforce the successful growing needs to have the economics thing, like it need to put the economic hat on. So yeah, hopefully that came across. And yeah, enjoy
Yeah,
your rest.
and yeah, just to say to everyone, go and check out their events, like their in-person stuff. They've got loads of really brilliant workshops and courses and stuff going on at their site, which is beautiful. If you're ever in the southwest, and also again, go and check out becoming an OGA member if you're not already. Yeah, thanks, Hamish. We'll see you again soon.
Cool.
Tune in soon to the podcast to hear a couple of the middle ground growers on there as well.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Cool. Thanks
Cool.
so much. Thanks for hosting.
Nice one. Thank you. Have a lovely evening, everyone.
Yeah. Bye everybody. Enjoy your Wednesday evenings.